Sarah Mitchell stood motionless on the weathered porch of Collins Trading Company, watching as the stagecoach that had carried her over 400 miles disappeared around the bend, leaving only dust and silence in its wake. The crisp October air bit at her cheeks as she clutched her single carpetbag, the sum of her worldly possessions. Far from the comforts of Boston's cobblestone streets, the rugged frontier settlement of Pine Ridge stretched before her, a cluster of wooden buildings, huddled against the imposing backdrop of the Eagle Mountain Range. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her like an anvil. Henry Donovan, the man who had exchanged letters with her for 8 months, the cattle rancher who had promised marriage and a new beginning, had taken one look at her face and declared their arrangement null and void. "This wasn't what I agreed." "Two," he had said, his voice as cold as the mountain wind. "Your letters never mentioned this." His eyes had skimmed across the network of pitted scars that marked the left side of her face from temple to chin, the lasting reminder of the smallpox that had nearly claimed her life 2 years prior. The memory of his revulsion burned hotter than the disease ever had. Sarah swallowed hard against the lump in her throat, fighting the urge to touch the scars that had destroyed her prospects in Boston and now threatened to leave her destitute in this wilderness outpost. At 32, Sarah was painfully aware of her precarious situation. An orphaned schoolteacher with only $26 to her name, she now stood stranded in an unfamiliar territory with winter approaching and no connections whatsoever. The letters from Henry had seemed like divine providence after the Boston Academy had released her from her teaching position. Parents had complained that her scarred face frightened the younger children, despite her exceptional academic credentials. The trading post door creaked open behind her. "You planning to stand there till sundown, miss?" The voice belonged to a stout woman with grey-streaked hair and shrewd eyes. "I'm Martha Collins. This is my establishment." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, straightening her spine despite her exhaustion. "I was meant to meet Henry Donovan, but there's been a misunderstanding." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly as they took in Sarah's scarred face, then traveled to the departing dust cloud of the stagecoach. Understanding dawned in her expression. "Donovan," she said flatly, "that explains it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "Is there lodging available in town?" Sarah asked, clutching her carpetbag tighter. "And perhaps work? I'm a qualified teacher, though I can turn my hand to most tasks." Martha considered her for a long moment. Lodging's scarce, with the mining surveyors taking most rooms. As for teaching, she hesitated. "Pine Ridge has a schoolhouse, but Miss Winters handles the children, has done for nearly 20 years. Sarah's heart sank further. Her one marketable skill rendered useless in yet another community. "There's a small room above the stables that Harold Jenkins sometimes rents," Martha continued. "Not much, but it's clean and has a stove. As for work..." The sudden crash of breaking glass interrupted her, followed by angry voices from inside the trading post. "Excuse me," Martha sighed, disappearing back inside to deal with the commotion. Left alone once more, Sarah gazed down Pine Ridge's main street. Unlike Boston's grand avenues, it was little more than a rutted dirt road, lined with false-fronted buildings. A church with a modest steeple stood at the far end, while nearer a sign swung in the breeze. Reed's Forge. Smoke billowed from its stone chimney, and the rhythmic clanging of metal on metal carried through the clear mountain air. That's when she saw him. A man emerged from the smithy, his imposing figure silhouetted against the forge's glow. Even from a distance, Sarah could tell he was uncommonly tall, with shoulders broad enough to suggest immense physical strength. He carried a completed horseshoe in a pair of tongs, moving toward a water barrel to quench the hot metal. When he turned toward the light, Sarah caught her breath. The right side of his face was marked by a jagged scar that ran from temple to jaw, pulling his mouth slightly downward and leaving a patchwork of healed tissue where his beard couldn't grow. The left side remained untouched. Strong jawline, straight nose, clear blue eyes beneath a heavy brow. Unlike the furtive, uncomfortable glances she'd grown accustomed to in Boston, the blacksmith's gaze was direct and unashamed when it met hers across the street. There was no shock in his expression, no revulsion or pity, just a moment of quiet recognition before he returned to his work. The trading post door swung open again, and Martha reappeared with a steaming mug. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing Sarah a cup of hot cider. "Gets cold quick once the sun starts dropping behind those mountains." "Thank you," Sarah replied, warming her hands around the mug. "That's very kind." Martha waved away her thanks. "Harold should be back from delivering supplies to the miners by supper time. I'll speak to him about the room." She paused, studying Sarah with newfound consideration. "Meanwhile, I could use help taking inventory if you're willing. Can you manage figures?" "I taught mathematics alongside literature and history," Sarah confirmed, hope kindling within her. "Good. Pays not much, 75 cents a day plus meals, but it'll tide you over until something more suitable comes along." It was less than a quarter of what she'd earned as a teacher in Boston, but Sarah recognized the lifeline being offered. "I'd be most grateful for the opportunity, Mrs. Collins." "Martha," the older woman corrected. "We don't stand on ceremony much in Pine Ridge." Her gaze drifted toward the blacksmith shop. "That's Thomas Reed, by the way. Served with distinction in the war, lost half his face at Antietam, but saved his captain and 2 other men." Sarah followed her gaze, watching as Thomas disappeared back into his forge. "He seems at peace with his injury." "Wasn't always," Martha replied, lowering her voice. "First year after he came here, barely spoke to anyone, worked from dawn till dusk, then shut himself away with his books. Folks were scared of him. At first, not just the scarring, but his size and silence. Now, though," she smiled faintly, "most respected man in Pine Ridge. Wouldn't have this town without him." Before Sarah could inquire further, a commotion arose from the far end of the street. A well-dressed man on horseback approached, accompanied by 2 mounted companions. His fine coat and polished boots marked him as a man of means, especially in this frontier setting. Martha's expression tightened. "Edward Donovan," she muttered. "Henry's older brother and self-appointed king of the county." "Donovan?" Sarah repeated, her stomach clenching. This must be a relative of the man who had rejected her mere hours ago. "Owns the largest cattle operation this side of the mountain. Half the town's in debt to him in some fashion." Martha's disapproval was evident. "Came out from St. Louis 10 years back with money and connections. Been bending Pine Ridge to his will ever since. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Edward Donovan reined his horse to a stop near the trading post steps. He was handsome in a sharp, calculating way, clean-shaven with silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. His keen eyes assessed Sarah with undisguised curiosity. "Mrs. Collins," he greeted Martha with practiced charm, "I see you're entertaining a visitor." "Miss Mitchell just arrived on today's coach," Martha replied, her tone carefully neutral. Understanding dawned in Donovan's eyes. "Ah, you must be Henry's correspondence bride." His gaze slid to Sarah's scarred cheek, then away with practiced casualness. "My brother sent word about the unfortunate situation." Sarah felt heat rising in her face, but years of enduring stares and whispers had taught her to maintain her composure. "Mr. Donovan," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "A regrettable misunderstanding," Edward continued smoothly. "Henry can be impulsive. I've spoken with him about his handling of the matter. There's no misunderstanding," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Your brother made his preferences quite clear. Edward nodded, seemingly impressed by her directness. Nevertheless, I'd like to make amends for my family's behavior. The return stage doesn't come through for another week, but I'll personally cover your fare back to Boston, as well as accommodation until then. The offer was both generous and humiliating, a payment to ensure she removed herself from Pine Ridge as quickly as possible. Before Sarah could respond, another voice joined the conversation. Miss Mitchell has accepted a position here, Martha interjected. She's helping with my accounts. Edward's eyebrows rose slightly. Is that so? Well, Pine Ridge welcomes hard workers regardless of their circumstances. He tipped his hat. If you change your mind about returning east, my offer stands. As Donovan and his companions continued toward the saloon at the end of the street, Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you, she said to Martha. You didn't have to do that. Wasn't entirely a lie, Martha replied pragmatically. I do need help with the inventory. She studied Sarah thoughtfully. Donovans are used to getting their way. Edward's more dangerous than Henry. Smarter, more patient. If he wants you gone from Pine Ridge, it's not out of family loyalty. What do you mean? Not sure yet, Martha admitted. But in my experience, when Edward Donovan takes an interest in something or someone, there's usually profit involved. Somewhere. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Pine Ridge, Sarah found herself absorbed in Martha's ledgers. Years of teaching had made her meticulous with figures, and she quickly identified several discrepancies in the trading post's accounts. Places where Martha had been underpaid for goods or overcharged for supplies. This can't be right, Sarah said, showing Martha a particular entry. You've been shorted 20% on these fur trades compared to market rates in the last settlement reports. Martha peered at the numbers and frowned. Donovan's company handles transport to the larger markets, claims these are the best prices he could secure. Based on these figures, someone is pocketing a significant difference, Sarah observed. And it's not benefiting the trappers or your business. A contemplative look crossed Martha's face. Interesting that you spotted that so quickly. She glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice. Thomas has been saying the same for months. Several businesses in town have noticed similar patterns. Before they could discuss further, the trading post door swung open, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the imposing figure of Thomas Reed. Up close, he was even more striking, towering well over 6 feet, his broad shoulders and powerful arms speaking to years of working metal. His clothes were simple but well kept, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up despite the autumn chill. Martha, he greeted, his deep voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. Wagon wheels repaired, should hold better than new. Reliable as always, Martha smiled. Thomas, this is Sarah Mitchell. She's helping with the accounts. Thomas turned to Sarah, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. No awkward glance away from her scars, no pitying smile, just a simple acknowledgement of her presence. Miss Mitchell, he said with a slight nod. Mr. Reed, Sarah replied, finding her voice. Mrs. Collins speaks very highly of your work. A ghost of a smile touched the undamaged side of his mouth. Martha's kind. His gaze shifted to the ledgers spread before them. Finding everything in order? Not exactly, Martha answered before Sarah could formulate a diplomatic response. Miss Mitchell has a good eye for numbers, spotted those discrepancies in the fur trading accounts immediately. Thomas's expression sharpened with interest. The 20% variance? Indeed, Sarah confirmed, surprised. You've noticed it too. Been tracking it across several businesses, he replied. It's consistent, too deliberate to be market fluctuation. Miss Mitchell was just explaining she's educated in mathematics, Martha added. Thomas studied her with new consideration. Teaching background? Yes, Sarah admitted. In Boston until recently. Something flickered in his eyes, understanding, perhaps. Education's valuable out here, he said simply, especially with winter coming. People get hungry for learning when the snow piles high. Martha nodded thoughtfully. That reminds me, the community reading circle meets Wednesday evenings in the church hall. Mostly settlers sharing books and learning from each other. Miss Winters tries to guide them, but she focuses on the children's education. I'd be happy to attend, Sarah said, the prospect of engaging with literature again lifting her spirits slightly. The door opened again, admitting a wiry man in his 60s with weather-beaten features. "Wheel holding up, Thomas?" he asked, then paused upon noticing Sarah. "Didn't realize you had company, Martha." "Harold, this is Sarah Mitchell." Martha introduced them. "Miss Mitchell, Harold Jenkins. He manages the livery stables and has that room we discussed." Harold's eyes widened slightly as they took in Sarah's scarred face, but to his credit, his gaze quickly returned to meet hers. "Rooms. Nothing fancy," he said, "but it's private and weather-tight. $5 a week, includes firewood. $5 would consume nearly a fifth of Sarah's remaining funds each week." She hesitated, calculating how long her money would last while she established herself in Pine Ridge. Thomas seemed to sense her concern. "Harold," he said, "Miss Mitchell's helping Martha with the accounts. Maybe a trade could be arranged. Room in exchange for keeping your books straight. Your ledgers looked like chicken scratch last time I saw them." Harold appeared intrigued by the suggestion. "That true? You're good with numbers?" "I am." Sarah confirmed, grateful for Thomas's unexpected advocacy. "Could use help making sense of the feed costs and boarding fees," Harold admitted. "Been meaning to sort it out for months." 2 hours each evening working on Harold's accounts in exchange. "For the room," Martha proposed. "That's fair, isn't it?" A deal was quickly struck, and Sarah found herself with both employment and lodging secured within hours of being abandoned in Pine Ridge, an outcome she couldn't have anticipated when the stagecoach departed without her. As dusk settled over the town, Thomas offered to carry Sarah's carpetbag to the livery stables. "It's on my way," he explained simply. They walked in comfortable silence down Pine Ridge's main street. Lamps were being lit in windows, and the distant mountains had turned purple against the deepening sky. Despite the day's tumultuous beginning, Sarah felt an unexpected sense of calm settling over her. "You came to marry Henry Donovan," Thomas said suddenly, the statement lacking any judgment. Sarah glanced at him, surprised by his directness. "Yes," she admitted. "We corresponded for 8 months. He described himself as a man who valued intelligence and character over superficial qualities." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Evidently, that only applies to invisible qualities." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Pine Ridge isn't Boston," he said after a moment. "People judge differently here. Some better, some worse, but survival tends to clarify what truly matters." "Is that why you stayed?" Sarah asked. "After returning from the war?" His pace slowed slightly. "Couldn't go home," he admitted. "Family farm was gone, and people, even family, look at you differently when you come back changed." His hand rose unconsciously to the scarred side of his face. "Not just this, something inside changes too." "I understand," Sarah said softly. "After the smallpox, it wasn't just my appearance that altered. My place in the world shifted. Doors that had always been open suddenly closed." Thomas studied her with quiet intensity. "New doors open, too," he observed. "Different ones than you might have expected." They had reached the livery stables, a large, weathered structure with the scent of hay and horses hanging in the evening air. Harold emerged from inside, wiping his hands on a rag. "Got the room ready," he announced. It's not much, but I put fresh linens on the bed and lit the stove to take the chill off. Thank you, Sarah said sincerely. That's very thoughtful. As Harold led them around to the external staircase that accessed the room above the stables, they passed a small corral where a magnificent black horse stood. The animal tossed its head as Thomas approached. "That's Thunder," Harold explained, noticing Sarah's interest. "Thomas is gelding, meanest beast I ever handled until Thomas came along." Thomas reached over the fence, and the supposedly difficult horse immediately nuzzled his outstretched hand. "He's not mean," Thomas corrected quietly. "Just been misunderstood." The parallel wasn't lost on Sarah. She watched as the massive Blacksmith gentled the powerful animal with nothing more than a soft word and a careful touch. In that moment, something shifted in her perception of Pine Ridge and her unexpected arrival here. Perhaps, like Thomas and his horse, she simply needed to find the place where her true worth would be recognized. Harold's room proved to be small, but tidy. A narrow bed with an iron frame, a three-legged table with a single chair, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, and a washstand with a cracked mirror. A braided rug covered part of the wooden floor, and the single window overlooked the main street. "Outhouse is behind the stables," Harold explained. "Pump for water's in the yard. You can heat what you need on the stove." "It's perfect," Sarah said, meaning it. After the uncertainty of the day, having a private space of her own felt like luxury. "I'll leave you to settle in," Thomas said from the doorway, setting down her carpetbag. "Reading Circle meets at 7 on Wednesday if you're interested. I could show you the way." The offer clearly cost him some effort. Sarah suspected Thomas Reed wasn't a man who extended social invitations frequently. "I'd appreciate that," she replied. After both men departed, Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed, finally alone with her thoughts. The day had been a pendulum swinging between despair and unexpected kindness. Henry Donovan's rejection had cut, deeply reopening wounds she'd thought healed. But the subsequent hours had brought encounters she couldn't have anticipated. Martha's practical assistance, Harold's straightforward acceptance, and most surprisingly, Thomas Reed's quiet understanding. All had combined to create a fragile foundation beneath her feet, where she'd expected only freefall. Sarah moved to the small window, gazing out at Pine Ridge as it settled into evening routine. Across the street, she could see the glow of Thomas's forge still burning despite the late hour. His powerful silhouette moved before the flames, the rhythmic rise and fall of his hammer shaping hot metal to his will. She wondered about his story, what battles he'd fought beyond the one that had marked his face, what losses had driven him to this remote settlement, what strength had allowed him to forge respect from initial fear. There was a steadiness about him that called to something in her that had been badly shaken by recent events. Sarah turned from the window and began unpacking her meager possessions. Among them was a small leather-bound volume of Emerson's essays, a parting gift from the headmistress who had regretfully released her from the Boston Academy. She ran her fingers over the embossed cover, finding comfort in its familiar texture. "Trust thyself," Emerson had written. "Every heart vibrates to that iron string." Perhaps here, in this rugged place so far from everything familiar, she would find her own iron string again. That core of resilience that Smallpox had tested but never truly broken. As she placed the book on the small table beside her bed, Sarah felt something unfamiliar stirring within her chest. Not quite hope, she was too practical for that, but possibility. And for tonight, that was enough. The following morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting intricate patterns on her window. Sarah dressed quickly in the chilly room, grateful for the heavy woolen shawl she'd packed. After rekindling the stove, she made her way downstairs, to find Harold already at work in the stables. "Morning, Miss Mitchell," he called, pitching hay into a stall. "Sleep well?" "Quite soundly, thank you," she replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. Despite the strange surroundings and tumultuous previous day, exhaustion had granted her dreamless sleep. "Martha's expecting you at 8, Harold reminded her. "Best not keep her waiting. She runs that trading post tighter than a drum." Sarah nodded gratefully for the reminder. "I'll look at your accounts this evening, as agreed." Pine Ridge was already stirring to life as Sarah made her way down the main street. Sarah glanced down at the columns of figures she'd been analyzing, the discrepancies in the fur trading accounts. "Possibly," Thomas agreed, "or something else entirely." Wednesday evening brought the first snowfall of the season to Pine Ridge, delicate flakes drifting from a pewter sky to dust the town's wooden walkways. Sarah paused in Harold's stables, watching the transformation with childlike wonder. Boston's snows had always seemed an inconvenience, slush-filled streets and treacherous ice, but here in the shadow of the Eagle Mountains, the pristine whiteness seemed to purify the rugged landscape. "First snow's always the prettiest," Harold commented, coming to stand beside her. "By February we'll all be cursing it." "How severe do the winters get?" Sarah asked, suddenly concerned about her limited wardrobe of Eastern garments. "Bad enough," Harold admitted. "Valley's protected from the worst of it, but we can get snowed in for weeks. Best stock up on supplies while you can." And the prospect of isolation added urgency to Sarah's efforts to establish herself in Pine Ridge. 2 days of working with Martha's ledgers had convinced her that Edward Donovan's business dealings warranted deeper investigation. But she would need more than suspicions to challenge a man of his influence. Sarah returned to her room to prepare for the reading circle, refreshing her appearance as best she could. The cracked mirror above her washstand reflected what it always did. A woman of 32 with intelligent hazel eyes, chestnut hair, pinned in a simple knot, and the network of pitted scars that had become her defining feature in others' eyes. She had long ago abandoned any attempt to hide them with powder or strategic hairstyles. The scars were part of her now, a map of survival etched into her skin. A knock at her door startled her from her reflection. She opened it to find Thomas Reed standing awkwardly on the landing, snow dusting his broad shoulders and dark hair. He had exchanged his work clothes for clean trousers and a woolen coat, though he remained imposing even in his finer attire. "Evening, Miss Mitchell," he greeted, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Thought we might walk together to the church."
"Hall."
"Thank you, Mr. Reed," Sarah replied, gathering her shawl and the Emerson volume she'd brought from Boston. "That's very considerate." They walked in companionable silence through the thickening snow, their footprints marking a path down Pine Ridge's main street. Candles and oil lamps glowed in windows, casting golden squares onto the whitening ground. The church steeple stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its modest bell now silent until Sunday services. "How are Martha's ledgers progressing?" Thomas asked as they approached the church hall. "Slowly but steadily," Sarah replied carefully, mindful of Martha's warning about Donovan's far-reaching influence. "I've reorganized her accounting system, which should make future tracking more efficient." Thomas nodded, understanding her caution. "Found anything else of interest?" "Several patterns that warrant further investigation," she admitted, "though I'd need access to other businesses' records to confirm my suspicions." "Such as?" Sarah hesitated, then decided to trust him. "The discrepancies aren't limited to fur trading. There are similar shortfalls in mining supply accounts, livestock sales, and land transactions, always benefiting the same interests." "Donovan's," Thomas concluded grimly. "So it appears, but proving deliberate fraud rather than market fluctuations would require more documentation than Martha possesses." No, they had reached the church hall, a simple wooden structure adjacent to the main sanctuary. Light and the murmur of voices spilled from its windows into the snowy evening. Be careful who you share those observations with, Thomas warned quietly, as they paused outside the door. Donovan has friends in unexpected places. And enemies? Sarah questioned, studying his scarred profile. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. More than he realizes. The reading circle proved to be a diverse gathering. About 20 residents of Pine Ridge, seated on wooden chairs, arranged in a loose circle. Sarah recognized Martha and Harold, as well as several customers from the trading post. An elderly woman with steel-gray hair and ramrod posture appeared to be leading the proceedings, a well-worn copy of Thoreau's Walden open on her lap. "Ah, Thomas," she exclaimed upon their entrance, "and you must be Miss Mitchell. I'm Eleanor Winters, the school teacher." She extended a hand firmly, her sharp eyes taking in Sarah's scarred face without comment. "Martha mentioned you've joined our community, a fellow educator, I understand." "Yes, from Boston," Sarah confirmed, warmed by the straightforward greeting. "Though currently assisting with accounting rather than teaching." "Numbers have their own poetry," Miss Winters declared, "but I suspect literature calls to you still, or you wouldn't be here." She gestured to the vacant chairs. "We were just discussing the virtue of simplicity in Thoreau's philosophy. Perhaps you'd share your thoughts?" Thus invited, Sarah found herself drawn into a surprisingly sophisticated literary discussion. Despite Pine Ridge's isolation, its reading circle demonstrated genuine intellectual curiosity. A miner quoted Whitman from memory, while a rancher's wife offered insightful comparisons between Thoreau's deliberate solitude and frontier existence. Throughout the evening, Sarah was acutely aware of Thomas Reed's presence beside her. Unlike many men of physical strength, he seemed comfortable in intellectual company, occasionally offering thoughtful observations on the text. His deep voice commanded attention without demanding it, and Sarah noticed others in the circle treated him with obvious respect. "You've read extensively," she commented during a brief pause while refreshments were distributed. "Books travel well," he replied. "Simply brought my father's library west with me, not much else survived." The statement contained volumes of unspoken loss, but before Sarah could inquire further, the church hall door swung open, admitting a rush of cold air and Edward Donovan's imposing figure. Beside him stood a slender woman wrapped in furs. Her blonde hair, arranged in an elaborate style more suited to St. Louis drawing rooms than a frontier reading group. "Victoria," Miss Winters greeted, her tone noticeably cooler than the welcome she had extended to Sarah. "How unexpected. You rarely join our humble gatherings." "Eleanor," the fur-clad woman replied with practiced cordiality. "Edward insisted. We brave the snow. He mentioned you had a newcomer with literary inclinations." All eyes turned to Sarah, who felt heat rise in her cheeks at the deliberate scrutiny. Edward Donovan's gaze held calculating interest, while his wife's traveled from Sarah's simple dress to her scarred cheek with poorly disguised distaste. "Indeed," Miss Winters confirmed, gesturing towards Sarah. "Miss Mitchell has been contributing most insightfully to our discussion of Thoreau." Victoria Donovan's perfect features arranged themselves into a semblance of polite interest. "How fascinating. And what brings you to our wilderness outpost, Miss Mitchell? Thoreau's experiment in deliberate living, perhaps?" The question dripped with patronizing amusement. Before Sarah could respond, Thomas's deep voice cut through the tension. "Miss Mitchell brings valuable skills to Pine Ridge," he stated flatly, "both educational and organizational." Victoria's gaze flickered to Thomas, barely disguising her revulsion at his scarred face. "How fortunate for our little settlement," she replied, her tone making it clear she considered it anything but. "Though I imagine a woman of education might find more suitable employment than bookkeeping at a trading post. I find honest." Work with honest people entirely suitable, Sarah replied evenly. Though I appreciate your concern for my professional welfare, Mrs. Donovan. Edward chuckled, seemingly amused by her response. A wagon loaded with timber rumbled past, while shopkeepers swept their wooden walkways clear of dust and fallen leaves. The air carried the tantalizing scent of baking bread from somewhere nearby, reminding Sarah that she hadn't eaten since yesterday's brief lunch on the stagecoach. As she approached the trading post, she noticed Thomas Reed at his forge, already hard at work despite the early hour. Unlike yesterday, he wore only a light shirt despite the morning chill, the sleeves rolled up to expose powerfully muscled, forearms marked with the small burns and nicks of his trade. The scarred side of his face gleamed with sweat despite the cold as he hammered a glowing piece of metal. He looked up as she passed, pausing in his rhythm to nod a greeting. "Miss Mitchell." "Mr. Reed," she returned, strangely comforted by the simple acknowledgement. The trading post was already busy when Sarah entered. Two men in mining clothes examined tools near the back, while a young mother with a toddler on her hip selected fabric from a shelf of dry goods. Martha stood behind the counter, tallying a column of figures with a pencil stub. "There you are," she said, looking up with evident relief. "Ready to dive into those ledgers?" Martha quickly settled Sarah at a small desk near the back room, explaining their system of inventory and accounts. Despite the trading post's modest appearance, it served as the primary supplier for not only Pine Ridge, but also several mining operations in the surrounding mountains. The complexity of the business became apparent as Sarah examined the records. "This is quite sophisticated," she observed, noting Martha's careful tracking of credit extended to various customers. "Have to be," Martha replied pragmatically. "Cash is scarce out here, especially before the mining companies pay out. People trade goods, services, promises, all has to be accounted for properly or nobody eats come winter." By midday, Sarah had reorganized the ledger system and identified several more discrepancies beyond the fur trading accounts. She was so absorbed in her work that she barely noticed the trading post door opening until a shadow fell across her desk. "Well now, what have we here?" The voice was unfamiliar, male, cultured, with an undercurrent of amusement. Sarah looked up to find a well-dressed gentleman regarding her with undisguised curiosity. His fine coat and gold watch chain marked him as a man of means, while his shrewd eyes and precisely trimmed beard suggested a calculating nature. "Can I help you, Mr. Donovan?" Martha asked coolly from behind the counter, confirming Sarah's suspicion that this was Edward Donovan returned to the trading post. "Just making a neighborly call," Donovan replied smoothly, his gaze still fixed on Sarah. "I spoke with the stagecoach company this morning. They can arrange a special rate for Miss Mitchell's return journey whenever she's ready." Martha's expression tightened. "As I mentioned yesterday, Miss Mitchell has employment here." Of course," Donovan said indulgently. "Just ensuring the lady has options." He turned directly to Sarah. "My brother's behavior was inexcusable, Miss Mitchell. I hope you won't judge all of Pine Ridge by his poor example." "I judge people individually, Mr. Donovan," Sarah replied evenly, "based on their actions rather than their words." A smile spread across his face. "Well said. You're clearly an educated woman. May I ask what brought you to consider frontier life? Surely Boston offered more civilized opportunities." The question probed too directly at wounds still raw from yesterday's rejection. Before Sarah could formulate a response that preserved her dignity, the trading post door opened again, admitting Thomas Reed's towering frame. "Martha," he greeted, then stopped short at the sight of Donovan. His expression cooled noticeably. "Edward Reed," Donovan acknowledged, a similar chill entering his voice. "Still playing with fire, I see." His gaze flickered meaningfully to the blacksmith's scarred face. Still playing with other people's money, I see, Thomas countered, his deep voice level, despite the clear antagonism between the men. Tension crackled in the air like the static before a lightning strike. Martha moved swiftly to intercede. Thomas, did you finish those hinges for the schoolhouse? Just completed them, he confirmed, though his eyes remained fixed on Donovan. Miss Winters said the door's been sticking badly with the weather changing. Ah, our dedicated school teacher, Donovan remarked, the momentary tension giving way to his practiced charm once more. Speaking of which, Miss Mitchell, I understand you were an educator in Boston. Perhaps you might consider tutoring my daughter. She's 12, and her mother finds the local schoolhouse inadequate for a child of her standing. The offer caught Sarah by surprise. I would need to consider such an arrangement carefully, Mr. Donovan. Of course. It would be a private position, room and board at our ranch, plus a generous salary. Much more befitting your qualifications than... His gaze swept dismissively around the trading post. Inventory management. Martha's expression darkened at the implied insult. But before she could speak, Thomas cut in. Miss Mitchell just arrived yesterday, he said flatly. Seems premature to be recruiting her away already. Donovan raised an eyebrow. I wasn't aware Miss Mitchell's employment options were any concern of yours, Blacksmith. When they involve your family's habit of making and breaking promises, they become everyone's concern, Thomas replied, an edge entering his voice. The veiled reference to Henry's rejection brought heat to Sarah's cheeks, but also a surprising rush of gratitude for Thomas's unexpected defense. Donovan's smile thinned. As always, Reed, you overestimate your place in matters that don't concern you. He turned back to Sarah with renewed courtesy. My offer stands, Miss Mitchell. Visit our ranch when you're ready to discuss it properly. Martha can direct you. With a tip of his hat, he departed, leaving a wake of tension behind him. Well, Martha said into the awkward silence that followed. That was illuminating. What did he really want? Thomas asked, his gaze still fixed on the door through which Donovan had exited. To assess Miss Mitchell, Martha replied thoughtfully. The question is why. He mentioned tutoring his daughter, Sarah offered, though she too had sensed an ulterior motive behind the seemingly generous offer. Thomas shook his head. Victoria Donovan would never allow someone with... He gestured vaguely toward Sarah's scarred cheek. To instruct her precious daughter, the woman values appearances above all else. Then why offer the position? Sarah pressed, confused by the conflicting signals. Martha and Thomas exchanged a meaningful look. There's something in those ledgers, Martha said slowly. Something you found or might find that concerns him. Well said, Miss Mitchell. You remind me that my offer of tutoring position remains open. Victoria and I would be delighted to discuss it at your convenience. He glanced meaningfully at Thomas. A private residence would certainly offer more comfort than current arrangements. Thomas stiffened beside her but said nothing. Sarah felt the undercurrents of long-established animosity flowing between the men. You're very kind, she replied diplomatically. However, I've made commitments to Mrs. Collins and Mr. Jenkins that I intend to honor. Victoria's perfect eyebrows rose slightly. Loyalty is admirable, if occasionally misplaced. Should you reconsider, our daughter Catherine would benefit from a governess with Eastern refinement. The implication that Sarah might be hidden away as a governess, suitable for educating a child but not for public view, wasn't lost on her. She had encountered similar attitudes in Boston after her illness, when former acquaintances had suggested positions that would keep her conveniently out of sight. I'll bear that in mind, Sarah replied, refusing to show offense. Miss Winters, sensing the growing discomfort, deftly steered the conversation back to literature. The Donovans remained for another 15 minutes, Victoria contributing occasional remarks that demonstrated education without genuine interest before pleading the increasing snowfall as reason for early departure. "Curious," Martha commented after they left, the group relaxing visibly in their absence. "Victoria hasn't attended in over a year, not since we declined to change our selection to accommodate her preference for French novels." "Not curious at all," Miss Winters replied tartly. "Edward clearly wanted to assess Miss Mitchell further. The question is why he's taken such interest in a newcomer." "Perhaps he's simply being neighborly," suggested a young woman whom Sarah hadn't yet met. Thomas made a sound somewhere between a snort and a cough. "Edward Donovan hasn't performed a neighborly act unless it benefited him directly." "Thomas," Miss Winters chided gently, though her eyes held agreement, "let's not poison Miss Mitchell's impression of Pine Ridge with old grievances." The remainder of the reading circle passed pleasantly, but Sarah remained distracted by the Donovans' brief appearance. Their interest in her seemed disproportionate to her position as a newly arrived stranger, particularly given Victoria's obvious distaste for her scarred appearance. As the gathering dispersed and people headed home through the thickening snow, Thomas once again fell into step beside Sarah. "The Donovans didn't come for Thoreau," he observed, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "No," Sarah agreed, "they came to observe me, though I can't imagine why I warrant such scrutiny." Thomas was silent for several paces, fresh snow crunching beneath his boots. Finally, he spoke, his deep voice barely audible above the winter wind. "Edward believes everyone has a price or a vulnerability. He's trying to determine yours." "Why would he bother? I'm merely a bookkeeper at a trading post." "A bookkeeper who can read his ledgers," Thomas corrected, "who understands numbers well enough to recognize patterns, who might question what others have accepted." The implication was clear. Edward Donovan viewed her as a potential threat. The notion seemed absurd, given her precarious position as a newcomer with no connections or influence, yet Thomas's assessment aligned with her own instincts. What exactly is in those ledgers that concerns him so much, she wondered aloud. That's what he's afraid you'll discover. Thomas paused as they reached the livery stables, snowflakes catching in his dark hair and on his broad shoulders. "Be careful, Sarah. Donovan's influence extends beyond Pine Ridge." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the unexpected intimacy sent a curious warmth through her, despite the bitter cold. "You seem to know him well," she observed. Thomas's expression darkened. "Well enough. We came west on the same wagon train 8 years ago, before the war. Before." His hand rose unconsciously to the scarred side of his face. "We were different men then." The simple statement contained volumes of history, but Sarah sensed this wasn't the moment to press for details. "Thank you for accompanying me tonight," she said instead. "I enjoyed the discussion, as did I." He hesitated, seeming to debate something internally before continuing. "The first snow usually brings the trappers down from the mountains. They'll arrive by week's end if the pass remains clear." "Is that significant?" Sarah asked, puzzled by the apparent non sequitur. "They trade their furs through Martha," Thomas explained. "Might provide an opportunity to confirm your suspicions about the accounting discrepancies." Understanding dawned. They would know what prices they're promised versus what they receive. Thomas nodded. "Jacob Redhawk, in particular, he's been trading furs longer than anyone, keeps his own meticulous records. Would he speak with me? A stranger?" "He might," Thomas replied, a hint of a smile touching his scarred face, "if properly introduced." The offer of assistance touched Sarah deeply. This scarred, quiet man had repeatedly extended himself on her behalf since her arrival, first with Harold, then at the reading circle, and now with the trappers. His motives seemed genuine, unlike Edward Donovan's calculated interest. "I'd appreciate that introduction," she said sincerely. Thomas nodded once, then glanced at the sky where snow continued to fall in thickening flurries, storms worsening. "You have enough firewood for the night?" "I believe so," Sarah replied, though in truth she hadn't checked her supply. Thomas studied her doubtfully, then disappeared into the stables, returning moments later with an armful of split logs. "These should see you through till morning," he said, following her up the external stairs to her room. Sarah unlocked her door, suddenly self-conscious about the modest space that was now her home. Thomas set the wood beside her small stove without comment, his large frame making the room seem even more confined than it was. "Thank you," she said, removing her snow-dusted shawl. "You've been very kind since my arrival. I'm not sure why." Thomas straightened, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "Know what it's like," he said simply, "to arrive somewhere new, marked." The word hung between them, marked. So much more dignified than disfigured or scarred, acknowledging the reality without judgment. Sarah felt tears prick unexpectedly behind her eyes at his quiet understanding. "Does it ever become easier?" she asked softly, the question escaping before she could consider its intimacy. "Having people see only that first?" Thomas was silent. For a long moment, his scarred face thoughtful in the lamplight. "Yes," he finally answered. "Not because they stop seeing it, but because you stop caring what they see." The simplicity of his answer and the hard-won wisdom behind it touched something deep within Sarah. This man had walked the path she now traveled, had faced the stares and whispers and rejections, yet had somehow forged a life of dignity and respect in this frontier community. "I should go," Thomas said, moving toward the door. "Need to bank my forge fire before the storm worsens." "Of course," Sarah replied, suddenly reluctant to see him leave, yet unsure why his company felt so comforting. "Thank you again for the firewood and the company." He nodded once, then hesitated in the doorway. "Sarah," he said, his deep voice oddly gentle, "what Donovan does or thinks, it matters in Pine Ridge, but it doesn't define you here. Remember that." With those words he departed, his heavy footsteps fading down the wooden stairs as Sarah stood thoughtfully in her doorway, watching his tall figure move through the swirling snow toward his forge across the street. His parting message lingered in her mind as she prepared for bed, stoking the stove with his generously provided wood. 8 years in Pine Ridge had transformed Thomas Reed from a war-scarred stranger to a respected member of the community. Perhaps, in time, she too might find such acceptance, not despite her scars, but as a complete person who happened to bear them. For the first time since the smallpox had altered her life's course, Sarah fell asleep with something akin to hope warming, her chest alongside the stove's steady heat. Morning brought a transformed Pine Ridge, the town blanketed in 6 inches of pristine snow that glittered like diamond dust in the clear sunlight. Sarah woke to find ice patterns etched across her window pane, the room's temperature having dropped dramatically overnight despite the stove. After restarting the fire and performing hasty ablutions in water cold enough to steal her breath, she made her way carefully down the ice-slicked stairs to find Harold clearing a path through the snow. "Morning comes early in winter," he greeted, cheerfully, leaning on his shovel. "Best get to Martha's while the path is clear. More snow expected by nightfall." "Will the town be isolated?" Sarah asked, concerned about the implications for supplies. "Nah, not from a blow like this," Harold assured her. "Takes a proper blizzard to cut us off completely. This is just winter saying hello." The main street presented a picturesque scene. Smoke, rising in straight columns from chimneys, Pine trees festooned with white, townspeople clearing walkways and exchanging greetings as they went about their morning routines. Sarah could almost imagine herself in an illustration from a children's book, the frontier town rendered idyllic in its snowy splendor. Reality intruded as she passed Reed's forge, which stood silent and cold, no smoke rising from its chimney. The absence of Thomas's familiar hammering left a curious void in the morning soundscape. Sarah found herself pausing, wondering at his absence before continuing toward the trading post. Martha was arranging a display of woolen scarves and mittens when Sarah entered, stomping snow from her boots. "Perfect timing," Martha declared. "Winter inventory needs organizing. People will be coming in for cold weather supplies now that the season's announced itself." Sarah set to work, but found her attention repeatedly drawn to the forge across the street. By mid-morning, when there was still no sign of activity, she finally voiced her concern. "Is Mr. Reed unwell? His forge seems closed today." Martha glanced up from her inventory list with a knowing expression. Thomas rode out before dawn. One of the outlying homesteads, the Wilsons, have a child with fever. He's delivering medicine from Dr. Pierce and checking their winter preparations. "Mr. Reed delivers medicine?" Sarah asked, surprised. "I thought he was a blacksmith." "He's that and more," Martha replied. "Doctor can't always make the journey to distant homesteads, especially in winter. Thomas has a sturdy horse and knows the trails better than most. Been serving as informal circuit rider for years now." This unexpected glimpse into Thomas's a character added another dimension to Sarah's growing impression of the man. Not just a skilled blacksmith and surprisingly well-read individual, but someone who rode through snowstorms to help isolated families. The contrast with Edward Donovan's calculated self-interest couldn't have been sharper. "Will he return today?" Sarah asked, then felt heat rise in her cheeks at how the question might sound. "I mean, given the weather conditions." Martha's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Depends on the child's condition and whether another storm blows in. Thomas won't leave them if they're in need, no matter the weather." The day passed quickly as customers streamed into the trading post seeking winter supplies. Sarah found herself serving as impromptu clerk while Martha handled the more complex transactions. Despite her lack of retail experience, she discovered a natural aptitude for the work, her teacher's memory recalling prices and inventory locations with ease. By late afternoon, Sarah had assisted dozens of Pine Ridge residents, many of whom introduced themselves with frank curiosity about the newcomer. Some stared openly at her scarred face, but unlike Boston's pitying glances or averted eyes, the frontier folk seemed to accept her appearance as just another fact. Perhaps because many bore their own marks of frontier hardships. As dusk approached, bringing with it threatening snow clouds, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the frosted window, Sarah glimpsed a group of men on horseback approaching down the main street. 6 or 7 riders bundled against the cold, leading pack mules laden with bulging sacks. "The trappers," Martha announced with satisfaction, "earlier than expected. Must have started down when they saw the storm brewing." She turned to Sarah with sudden decisiveness. "You'll handle their trades." "Me?" Sarah asked, taken aback. "Surely they'd prefer to deal with you directly." "They trust my figures well enough," Martha replied, "but having a fresh set of eyes on the transactions might prove illuminating for all of us, especially given what you found in the ledgers." Before Sarah could protest further, the trading post door banged open, admitting a blast of cold air and the first of the trappers, a barrel-chested man with a full beard streaked with grey, and the weathered complexion of someone who lived primarily outdoors. "Martha!" he boomed, stamping snow from his boots. "Tell me you've got coffee brewing. Trail's colder than a banker's heart." "Jedediah Taylor," Martha introduced him to. "Sarah. Makes the best beaver traps west of the Mississippi and the worst jokes in 3 territories." The bearded man grinned, revealing a gap where his front tooth should have been. "And who's this?" he asked, studying Sarah with open curiosity. "Sarah Mitchell," Martha replied. "She's helping with the accounts and will be handling your trades today." Jedediah's bushy eyebrows rose slightly as he took in Sarah's scarred face, but his friendly expression didn't waver. "Pleasure, Miss Mitchell. Hope you're better with figures than Martha. Woman tried to convince me 2 + 2 makes 5 if one of 'em's a particularly fine pelt." "Slander and lies," Martha retorted good-naturedly. "Miss Mitchell, I'll fetch that coffee while you start the inventory. Full documentation on every pelt and its grade, if you please." The next hour passed in a flurry of activity as the trappers filed in, each bringing samples of their season's work. Sarah recorded each man's name, the quantity and quality of pelts, and the agreed-upon price per unit. Martha provided coffee and information about conditions in the settlements, while the trappers shared news from the high country. Sarah was just finishing the inventory for a young trapper named William when the door opened again, admitting a tall Native American man with silver threading through his black hair. His face bore the deep lines of someone who had spent decades in the elements, but his dark eyes remained sharp and observant as they swept the trading post. "Jacob," Martha greeted him warmly. "Wasn't sure you'd make it down before the pass. Closed." "Storm is coming," he replied simply. "Big one, 2 days, maybe 3. His gaze settled on Sarah with quiet assessment. "New face." "Sarah Mitchell," Martha introduced them. "Sarah, this is Jacob Redhawk. Best tracker in the territory and the only man who can find beaver where others swear there are none." "You keep books now," Jacob observed, gesturing to Sarah's ledger. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "I'm helping organize the accounts." A ghost of a smile touched the older man's weathered face. "Good. Martha's numbers dance too much." He reached into his pack and withdrew a small leather-bound journal. "My count. You compare." Sarah accepted the journal with surprise. Inside, she found meticulous records written in a flowing hand, dates, locations, pelt types, quantities, and previous year's prices. It was exactly the type of documentation Thomas had suggested might help confirm her suspicions about the fur. Trading discrepancies. "This is very thorough, Mr. Redhawk," she commented, impressed by his record-keeping. "Jacob," he corrected. "Memory fades, paper remembers." He tapped the journal significantly. "Shows patterns. 3 years. Prices drop. Not market. Someone takes difference." The directness of his statement confirmed Sarah's analysis. "You're aware of the discrepancies? Aware, not pleased." His dark eyes held no accusation toward Martha, suggesting he understood where the problem originated. "Thomas said you see numbers clearly. Might help." So Thomas had already spoken with him. Sarah felt a rush of gratitude for the blacksmith's behind-the-scenes advocacy on her behalf. "I'd like to compare your records with the trading post's accounts," she said carefully. "It might reveal exactly where the discrepancies occur." Jacob nodded once, then gestured to his pack. 62 beaver pelts, 17 marten, 8 fox. Grade yourself, then we talk price. The blizzard that had imprisoned Pine Ridge finally released its grip after 5 relentless days. When Sarah pushed open her door on the 6th morning, she found a transformed world. Pristine white blankets draped over buildings, massive icicles hanging from every eave, the main street carved into narrow canyons between snowdrifts taller than a man. The beauty was breathtaking, crystalline, and pure in the morning sunlight that now streamed from a cloudless sky. Her room above the stables had remained surprisingly comfortable throughout the storm, thanks largely to Thomas Reed's daily deliveries of firewood. Each visit had stretched longer than strictly necessary, their conversations flowing easily from immediate concerns to deeper matters. He had shared stories of his Tennessee childhood, his reluctant service in the war, and the shell blast at Antietam that had forever altered his path. In turn, she had described her teaching life in Boston, the house fire that had scarred her, while saving her niece and the subsequent unraveling of her carefully constructed life. Those conversations had revealed a man of unexpected depth, well-read, thoughtful, possessed of a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with his imposing physical presence. His scars, so stark upon first meeting, had gradually receded in her perception, becoming simply another feature of a face that expressed kindness, integrity, and occasionally a dry humor that surprised, delighted her. The storm had also provided time for Sarah to continue her work with the Trading Post ledgers. With each passing day, her findings had grown more concerning. Edward Donovan's financial manipulations extended far beyond skimming profits from fur trades. They comprised an intricate web of calculated transactions designed to concentrate economic power in his hands while appearing legitimate to casual inspection. Now, making her way carefully along the ice-crusted path toward the trading post, Sarah mentally organized her findings for the town council meeting scheduled for that afternoon. The blizzard had delayed the gathering originally planned days earlier, but with roads now passable within Pine Ridge itself, Mayor Wilson had confirmed the session would proceed. Sarah found Martha already at work when she arrived, sorting through mail that had accumulated during the storm. The post rider finally made it through from Riverdale, the older woman explained, holding up several letters, including this for you. Sarah accepted the envelope with surprise. The return address showed it originated from Boston, specifically from the headmistress of her former school. She tucked it into her pocket, deciding to read it privately later. Thomas stopped by earlier, Martha continued, a knowing twinkle in her eye. Said the council meeting's confirmed for 2 o'clock. He seemed particularly concerned that you be properly prepared. Sarah felt warmth rise in her cheeks at Martha's obvious implication. Mr. Reed has been very supportive of the accounting investigation, she replied with deliberate formality. Mr. Reed, is it? Martha teased. After all those long conversations, by your stove, he's Thomas to everyone else in Pine Ridge. Thomas, then, Sarah conceded, unable to suppress a smile. Though his interest remains primarily professional, I'm sure. Martha snorted softly. That man hasn't shown primarily professional interest in anyone since arriving in Pine Ridge 8 years ago. Half the single women in town tried catching his eye before deciding he was married to that forge of his. She studied Sarah thoughtfully, until you stepped off that stagecoach, that is. Before Sarah could formulate a response, the trading post door swung open, admitting Jacob Redhawk, bundled against the cold. The Native American trapper nodded greeting to both women, then directed his attention to Sarah. Council meets today, he stated. You speak about numbers. Yes, Sarah confirmed. I'll be presenting findings regarding certain accounting discrepancies affecting multiple businesses. Jacob nodded, reaching into his pack to withdraw his leather-bound journal. Add these, he said, opening to a specific page. Shows 5 years, not 3. Pattern started small, grew bolder. Sarah examined the extended records with interest. Jacob's meticulous documentation indeed revealed that the discrepancies had begun as minor irregularities before growing to the substantial skimming operation currently in place. The evolution suggested increasing confidence that no one would notice or challenge the practice. This is extremely helpful, she told him sincerely. It demonstrates deliberate escalation rather than random market fluctuations. The trapper's weathered face remained impassive, but satisfaction flickered in his dark eyes. Thomas says you see truth where others see only figures. Good skill. The simple compliment touched Sarah deeply. In Boston, her mathematical aptitude had been regarded as merely adequate for teaching young ladies basic arithmetic, certainly nothing worth particular notice. Yet here in Pine Ridge, this skill had provided her purpose and respect within days of arrival. "Will you attend the council meeting?" she asked Jacob. "Will watch," he confirmed. "Not speak unless asked. Town politics." He made a dismissive gesture. "White man's business mostly, but affects trading, affects hunting grounds eventually." Sarah nodded, understanding. The Native American trappers occupied a complex position essential to the region's economy, yet marginalized in its governance. "Your records strengthen the case considerably," she assured him. "They show the historical pattern better than any other documentation we have." After Jacob departed, Sarah spent the morning finalizing her presentation, organizing evidence into a clear narrative supported by specific examples. By noon, she had assembled a compelling case demonstrating how Donovan's various enterprises systematically extracted wealth from Pine Ridge businesses through manipulated transactions. Martha closed the trading post early, allowing them time to prepare for the council meeting. "Best wear your finest," she advised Sarah. "Edward Donovan." "Certainly will. Appearances matter in these situations, unfair though that may be." Sarah returned to her room to change into her best dress, a deep green wool with modest trim that had once graced Boston lecture halls. As she fastened the buttons, her fingers brushed against the letter still in her pocket. She withdrew it, breaking the seal with curious fingers. The headmistress's elegant script covered 2 pages with unexpected news. The school's enrollment had increased substantially, creating need for additional teaching staff. Furthermore, parents who had previously objected to Sarah's scarred appearance had either withdrawn their children or reconsidered their position. The letter concluded with a formal offer to reinstate Sarah to her former position at a slightly increased salary, with the postscript, "Your absence has made your value all the clearer, my dear. We would be most grateful for your return." Sarah sat heavily on her narrow bed, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. Just 2 weeks earlier, such an offer would have seemed miraculous, a restoration of everything she had lost, a chance to reclaim her former life. Now, it struck her as strangely hollow. Boston represented security, familiarity, a known path. Yet, as she gazed around her modest room above the stables, then out the window to Pine Ridge's snow-covered main street, Sarah realized how rapidly this frontier settlement had come to feel like a place where she might belong, not despite her scars, but somehow because they had led her here, to a community where resilience mattered more than appearances, where her skills were valued, where a battle-scarred blacksmith saw her more clearly than anyone in her previous life had managed. A knock at her door interrupted these reflections. She opened it to find Thomas on the landing, snow dusting his shoulders and dark hair. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance, clean-shaven on the uninjured side of his face, wearing a pressed shirt and his best coat despite the cold. "Thought I might escort you to the council meeting," he said, an uncharacteristic uncertainty in his deep voice. "If that's acceptable." "I'd appreciate the company," Sarah replied, tucking the Boston letter into her drawer for later consideration. She gathered her shawl and the folder containing her accounting evidence, then joined him on the narrow staircase. They walked in companionable silence through Pine Ridge's snow-carved pathways. The town had emerged from the blizzard with remarkable resilience. Shopkeepers clearing their entrances, children building snow forts in vacant lots, neighbors checking on one another with particular attention to the elderly. Thomas had coordinated much of this community response, Sarah knew, organizing snow-clearing teams and distributing essential supplies throughout the storm. "Are you prepared for Donovan's reaction?" Thomas asked as they approached the town hall. "As much as possible," Sarah replied honestly. "I have facts, figures, and documentation from multiple sources." Whether that's sufficient against his influence remains to be seen. Thomas nodded, understanding in his blue eyes. Facts matter, but so does courage in presenting them. He hesitated, then added quietly, "Few have been willing to challenge Edward publicly. Your willingness to do so, it means a great deal to many here." "Including you?" Sarah asked, studying his scarred profile. "Especially me," he admitted. "I've opposed Edward's methods for years, but lacked the expertise to demonstrate exactly how his operations drain the community. You've provided that missing piece." The simple acknowledgement of her contribution warmed Sarah more than any elaborate compliment might have. Throughout her life, she had sought meaningful purpose, first through education, then through teaching. Now, in this unexpected place, under these unusual circumstances, she had found a way to apply her skills that genuinely mattered. Pine Ridge's town hall was already filling with residents when they arrived. The modest building, normally used primarily for council meetings and occasional social gatherings, now struggled to contain what appeared to be half the town's adult population. The blizzard's confinement had generated intense interest in the first public gathering following isolation. Mayor Wilson, a stout man with a practical demeanor, had arranged chairs in rows facing the council table. 5 council members occupied. This elevated position, the mayor himself, Dr. Pierce, Jacob Henderson from the Mercantile, Eleanor Winters, and a weathered cattle rancher named Buchanan, whom Sarah hadn't previously met. Edward Donovan sat in the front row, immaculately dressed in a suit that would have looked appropriate in a Boston financial district. Beside him, Victoria Donovan's elaborate coiffure and fur-trimmed jacket provided stark contrast to the practical woolens and simple styles of most Pine Ridge women. They presented a tableau of conscious sophistication, deliberately set apart from frontier pragmatism. Thomas guided Sarah to seats several rows back, murmuring greetings to various townspeople. As they passed, she noticed many curious glances directed their way. The imposing Blacksmith rarely attended council meetings unless specifically requested, she had learned, and never in the company of a woman. "Quite an audience for your presentation," Thomas observed quietly. Word spread about the accounting investigation. Sarah surveyed the crowded room, recognizing faces from the trading post, Harold's livery stable, the reading circle, and various businesses she'd visited during her brief time in Pine Ridge. Among them sat Jacob Redhawk, his weathered face impassive as he observed the proceedings from near the back wall. Mayor Wilson called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. "First item of business, community response to the recent blizzard," he announced. "Dr. Pierce will report on medical concerns, followed by assessments of food supplies and damage to structures." The preliminary matters proceeded efficiently, with various residents reporting minimal injuries, adequate provisions, and limited damage beyond fences downed by wind and snow weight. Throughout these proceedings, Edward Donovan remained silently attentive, occasionally leaning to whisper something to Victoria. His controlled demeanor betrayed no concern about the accounting investigation Sarah knew he must be aware of by now. Finally, Mayor Wilson cleared his throat. "Next item, financial review requested by multiple business owners concerning regional commerce practices. Miss Sarah Mitchell will present findings based on her analysis of trading post records and other participating businesses." All eyes turned towards Sarah as she rose, folder clutched perhaps too tightly in her hands. The weight of attention felt heavier than any classroom she had faced in Boston, particularly given Edward Donovan's calculated smile as he turned to observe her. "Thank you, Mayor Wilson," she began, voice steadier than she felt. "Over the past week, I've had the opportunity to examine accounting records from several Pine Ridge establishments, focusing primarily on transactions involving external markets for local goods." She approached the council table, laying out specific ledger pages she had copied to illustrate key points. These documents reveal a consistent pattern of discrepancies between reported market prices and actual payments received by local businesses. The variances occur primarily in transactions handled through intermediate shipping companies, particularly Donovan Transit Services. A murmur ran through the crowd at this direct naming. Edward's expression remained pleasant, though something hardened in his eyes. For example, Sarah continued, indicating specific entries, these fur trading records show pelts valued at market rates approximately 20% higher than payments received by both trappers and the trading post. Similar patterns appear in mining equipment sales, timber exports, and various other commerce involving transportation to external markets. She proceeded methodically through her evidence, explaining the pattern's escalation over time as documented in Jacob's records, the consistency across multiple business types, and the mathematical improbability of such discrepancies occurring randomly. Throughout her presentation, Sarah maintained a professional tone, focusing on facts rather than accusations. In conclusion, she finished after nearly 20 minutes, these records indicate systematic undervaluation of local goods when shipped to external markets, with the differential benefiting intermediary companies rather than either producers or local merchants. Mayor Wilson studied the documents with a furrowed brow. This is concerning indeed, Miss Mitchell. You've presented compelling evidence of financial irregularities affecting our community's prosperity. If I may, Edward Donovan interjected, rising smoothly from his seat, I believe I can clarify these apparent discrepancies. The mayor nodded permission, and Edward approached the council table with practiced confidence. While Miss Mitchell's mathematical analysis appears thorough, it fails to account for numerous factors affecting frontier commerce. Transportation costs fluctuate significantly based on weather conditions, supply chain disruptions, and seasonal variations in demand. He produced his own documents, professional-looking reports with printed letterheads from Denver and St. Louis. These market analyses demonstrate the price volatility Miss Mitchell has misinterpreted as deliberate manipulation. What appears to be systematic undervaluation is simply the reality of frontier economics. Costs rise, markets fluctuate, and transportation entails risks requiring appropriate compensation. The reasonable tone and official-looking documentation created visible uncertainty among council members. Sarah had anticipated this response. Donovan would present the discrepancies as normal business practice rather than calculated exploitation. Mr. Donovan offers a plausible explanation, Councilman Buchanan observed, examining the documents. These appear to be legitimate market reports from established firms. They may appear legitimate, Thomas Reed's deep voice cut through the murmuring crowd as he rose from his seat. But they cannot explain why identical goods shipped through alternative routes consistently receive higher market valuations. All eyes turned to the blacksmith, whose imposing presence commanded immediate attention. Edward's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. Mr. Reed, Mayor Wilson acknowledged, you have relevant information? I do, Thomas confirmed, approaching the council table. For the past 2 years, several businesses, including my forge, have periodically shipped goods through alternative means, wagon trains to Denver rather than Donovan Transit. In every instance, we received market prices averaging 18 to 20% higher than identical goods shipped through Mr. Donovan's company during the same time frame. This revelation caused a stir among both council members and observers. Edward's practiced smile faltered momentarily before reasserting itself. Alternative shipping arrangements naturally produce different results, he countered smoothly. Perhaps Mr. Reed negotiated more favorable terms, or perhaps his limited shipments happened to coincide with temporary market upswings. Not limited shipments, Jacob Redhawk interrupted, rising from his place along the wall. His participation clearly surprised many, including Edward. 3 winters. I sent half furs through Donovan, half through mountain trains to Denver. Same furs, same quality, same time. Mountain trains always pay more. Difference grows each year. The Native American trapper's testimony carried particular weight, given his reputation for honesty and his detailed record-keeping. Sarah noted several council members exchanging meaningful glances. Edward's composure showed its first significant crack. With all due respect to Mr. Redhawk, anecdotal experiences don't constitute evidence of impropriety. Frontier commerce entails countless variables affecting final settlements, which is precisely why we conducted controlled comparisons, Thomas replied firmly. Same goods, same time frames, different transport methods. The results consistently favor non-Donovan. Shipping options. Sarah stepped forward again, sensing the moment to reinforce their case. The mathematical improbability of such consistent discrepancies occurring randomly is astronomical, she explained, presenting additional calculations. The pattern demonstrates deliberate price manipulation rather than market fluctuation. Edward's pleasant facade finally slipped, revealing the calculating businessman beneath. "This is absurd," he snapped. "You've been in Pine Ridge barely a week, Miss Mitchell. Your understanding of Western commerce is necessarily limited by your Eastern perspective." "My understanding of mathematics is not limited by geography, Mr. Donovan," Sarah replied evenly. "Numbers function the same in Boston as they do in Colorado." A ripple of appreciative chuckles ran through the crowd, emboldening her to continue. Furthermore, these discrepancies don't merely represent abstract financial concern. They directly impact Pine Ridge's prosperity, reducing income for trappers, limiting expansion potential for local businesses, and concentrating wealth in enterprises that extract value rather than creating it. Victoria Donovan rose with icy dignity. "Really, Edward? Must we endure economic lectures from a schoolteacher who couldn't maintain her position in civilization? Perhaps her condition affects her reasoning as well as her appearance." The deliberate cruelty of the remark brought a shocked silence to the room. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but refused to show the hurt beneath her composure. Before she could respond, Eleanor Winter's crisp voice cut through the tension. "I find personal attacks entirely inappropriate during council business, Mrs. Donovan," the elderly schoolteacher declared firmly. "Miss Mitchell's professional credentials are impeccable, as I've personally verified through correspondence with her former headmistress. Her analysis deserves consideration based on merit rather than offensive speculation about her character." Thomas had half risen at Victoria's remark, his expression darkening dangerously, but something in Sarah's steadfast demeanor seemed to give him pause. Instead of the angry defense she half expected, he addressed the council with remarkable composure. "The content of Miss Mitchell's findings matters more than Mrs. Donovan's opinion of her qualifications," he stated. "If these accounting discrepancies were discovered by Mayor Wilson or Dr. Pierce, would they be dismissed so readily? Or is evidence only questionable when presented by someone Edward Donovan would prefer to discredit?" The pointed question hung in the air, highlighting the transparent attempt to undermine Sarah's credibility rather than address her findings. Several council members nodded thoughtfully, while mutters of disapproval directed at Victoria circulated through the crowd. Edward, recognizing the shifting sentiment, quickly adjusted his approach. "Perhaps we've become distracted from the central issue," he suggested, professional demeanor reasserting itself. "If local businesses feel their goods are undervalued, through my transport services, they're certainly free to make alternative arrangements. The marketplace will determine appropriate valuations." "A fair observation," Mayor Wilson acknowledged. though it presumes equal access to transportation options, which isn't always the case, given your company's exclusive contracts with several shipping connections. Contracts negotiated through proper business channels, Edward emphasized. If others wish to establish competing arrangements, nothing prevents them from doing so. Except limited capital to weather initial losses while establishing those connections, Thomas pointed out, particularly when existing businesses have been systematically underpaid for years, restricting their ability to accumulate necessary resources. The exchange continued in this vein for nearly an hour, Edward defending his business practices as legitimate, while Thomas, Sarah, and occasionally Jacob highlighted the purposeful extraction of wealth from the community. Throughout the debate, Sarah noticed council members becoming increasingly engaged, asking pointed questions that suggested growing skepticism toward Donovan's explanations. Finally, Mayor Wilson raised his hand for silence. I believe we've thoroughly examined this matter from multiple perspectives. The council will now deliberate on appropriate actions, if any. What possible actions could be justified? Edward demanded, his calculated charm slipping again. No laws have been broken. These are merely business arrangements between consenting parties. Arrangements based on misrepresented market conditions, Dr. Pierce observed mildly, which raises questions of fraudulent inducement at minimum. Furthermore, Eleanor Winters added, the council has responsibility for the community's economic welfare. If current practices demonstrably harm that welfare, we have both right and duty to explore remedies. Edward's expression hardened. I advise caution in making accusations that might become legally actionable, Dr. Pierce. And I remind the council that Donovan Enterprises employ more Pine Ridge residents than any other business, contribute the largest portion of local taxes, and have consistently supported community development. All admirable, Mayor Wilson acknowledged, and all compatible with fair business practices that allow other enterprises to thrive alongside yours. The council isn't suggesting dismantling your operations, Mr. Donovan, merely ensuring they operate transparently and equitably. After further discussion, the council voted unanimously to establish a community shipping cooperative that would arrange alternative transportation for local goods, circumventing Donovan Transit's effective monopoly. Additionally, they would send formal inquiries to Denver commercial authorities regarding market rate discrepancies documented in Sarah's report. Edward received these decisions with cold fury, barely masked behind professional courtesy. Pine Ridge may discover that independence carries unexpected costs, he remarked as the meeting concluded. Transportation infrastructure requires capital, connections, and expertise not readily available in frontier settlements. Perhaps, Thomas replied evenly, or perhaps we'll discover that mutual cooperation achieves more than exploitation ever could. The veiled exchange of threats and counter-threats wasn't lost on observers. As the council meeting dispersed, Sarah found herself surrounded by townspeople offering thanks for her analysis and congratulations on her presentation. The support felt surprisingly genuine, not the careful politeness she'd grown accustomed to in Boston after her scarring, but authentic appreciation for her contribution to the community. Thomas waited patiently at the edge of this impromptu gathering, his scarred face revealing quiet satisfaction at the outcome. When the crowd finally thinned, he approached, offering his arm as they prepared to depart. "You were magnificent," he said simply. "Clear, precise, unshakable, despite Donovan's attempts to discredit you." "I couldn't have stood firm without your support," Sarah replied as they stepped into the late afternoon chill. The setting sun cast long shadows across Pine Ridge's snow-covered main street, painting buildings in shades of gold and rose. "Victoria's comment about my condition might have undone me otherwise." Thomas's expression darkened momentarily. Her cruelty reveals more about her character than your worth, though I nearly forgot myself when she spoke. I noticed, Sarah acknowledged with a small smile. You seemed ready to defend my honor quite forcefully. Unnecessary, Thomas replied, genuine admiration warming his blue eyes. You defended yourself with more dignity than violence could have achieved. They walked in comfortable silence for several moments, each processing the council meeting's significance. Sarah found herself acutely aware of Thomas's solid presence beside her, the strength in the arm she held, the quiet confidence he projected despite, or perhaps because of, the scars that had once defined him to others. Edward won't relinquish control easily, she observed as they approached the livery stables. Today's decision challenges his economic dominance directly. Thomas nodded grimly. He'll retaliate, likely through indirect means initially. Pressure on businesses that supported the investigation, perhaps attempts to undermine the shipping, cooperative before it properly forms. And against you personally, Sarah asked, studying his profile in the fading light. You've opposed him more consistently than anyone. I've weathered his tactics before, Thomas replied with the calm of someone long accustomed to confrontation. My forge provides essential services difficult to replicate. More importantly, I own my land and building outright, purchased before Edward recognized their strategic value. They had reached the external staircase leading to Sarah's room. Thomas paused, seeming to debate something internally before continuing. Your position may be more vulnerable, he said finally. As a newcomer, without established place or property. You believe he might target me specifically? Sarah asked, unsurprised by the possibility. Edward Donovan had struck her as a man who identified and eliminated threats methodically. Almost certainly, Thomas confirmed. Your expertise made his methods visible after years of successful concealment. He won't forget that easily. The assessment was sobering, but not unexpected. Sarah had recognized the risk in challenging Pine Ridge's most powerful resident, yet had proceeded anyway. A decision she found she didn't regret despite potential consequences. I received a letter today, she said suddenly, remembering the headmistress's offer. From Boston. My former school wishes me to return. They've offered to restore my teaching position with increased salary. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes. Surprise followed by what might have been disappointment, though he masked it quickly. That's fortunate timing, he observed carefully. An opportunity to return to familiar surroundings and professional respect. Yes, Sarah agreed, studying his reaction. Precisely what I hoped for when I first left Boston. Will you accept? Thomas asked, his deep voice deliberately neutral despite the tension now evident in his posture. Sarah considered the question seriously, weighing safety and familiarity against the purpose and acceptance she'd found in Pine Ridge. A week ago, I would have done so without hesitation, she admitted. Now I find myself strangely reluctant. Because of Donovan's threats, Thomas asked, misunderstanding. You shouldn't allow intimidation to determine your decisions. Not because of threats, Sarah clarified, finding herself smiling despite the serious conversation. Because I've discovered unexpected value here, work that matters, people who see beyond appearances to ability, a community that needs precisely the skills I possess. Hope kindled in Thomas's expression. Pine Ridge would certainly benefit from your continued presence, he said carefully. The trading post's accounting has improved tremendously, and the reading circle. He hesitated, then added more personally, I've greatly valued our conversations. As have I, Sarah replied softly. She glanced toward her modest room above the stables, then back to the man standing before her, scarred like herself, tested by circumstance, yet possessed of a dignity and purpose that transcended physical appearance. Boston represents security, she continued thoughtfully. A known path, familiar challenges. Pine Ridge offers uncertainty, potential danger from Donovan's retribution, harsh winters, and frontier discomforts. Thomas nodded understanding, though something like resignation began settling in his features. Yet Pine Ridge also offers something Boston never truly did, Sarah concluded, decision crystallizing as she spoke. Opportunity to be valued for substance rather than appearance, to contribute meaningfully rather than be tolerated conditionally. "You're considering staying then?" Thomas asked, cautious hope returning to his voice. "More than considering," Sarah confirmed. "I intend to decline the Boston offer. My place is here now, helping establish the shipping cooperative, improving Martha's accounting systems, perhaps eventually teaching once Miss Winters retires." Relief and something deeper transformed Thomas's scarred features. For a moment, he seemed unable to formulate response, emotion rendering him uncharacteristically speechless. "I'm grateful to hear it," he finally managed, composure returning. "Pine Ridge will benefit greatly from your decision." "And you, Thomas?" Sarah asked softly, finding courage to voice the question that had hovered between them. Through blizzard conversations and council preparations, "Do you welcome my decision to remain?" The directness of her inquiry seemed to catch him off guard, but after a moment's hesitation, his response carried absolute certainty. "More than I have words to express," he admitted. The simple honesty more meaningful than elaborate declarations might have been. Snow began falling again as they stood there, gentle flakes, unlike the blizzard's fury, drifting lazily through the twilight to dust their shoulders and hair with crystalline white. Against this pristine backdrop, Thomas reached out hesitantly, his large hand coming to rest gently against Sarah's scarred cheek. "May I?" he asked, the question encompassing far more than the immediate gesture. Sarah nodded, unable to voice the tide of emotion rising within her. Thomas bent slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, before pressing his lips gently to hers in a kiss that spoke of acceptance, admiration, and possibility. When they separated, Sarah found herself studying his face. The strong features, the intelligent eyes, the scars that had once seemed his defining characteristic, but now registered simply as part of the whole man before her. She wondered if he saw her the same way, not defined by Smallpox's legacy, but complete despite it, or perhaps even strengthened by what she had endured. "We're quite the pair," she observed with a smile, reaching up to touch the scarred side of his face as he had touched hers. Both marked by circumstance, both rebuilding in unexpected places. "Better together than apart," Thomas suggested, his deep voice gentle in the falling snow, "if you're willing to consider such possibility." The invitation, tentative yet hopeful, filled Sarah with certainty she hadn't experienced since before the fire that had altered her life's course. This scarred blacksmith, with his quiet strength and perceptive mind, saw her completely. Intelligence, courage, flaws, and scars, and valued the totality rather than any single aspect. "I'm more than willing," she assured him, snow continuing, to drift around them like nature's blessing on possibilities neither had anticipated when Sarah stepped off the stagecoach barely 2 weeks earlier. Henry Donovan's rejection, what had seemed devastating tragedy at the time, had inadvertently delivered her to precisely where she belonged, not to a marriage based on illusion and conditional acceptance, but to a community where her skills mattered, and to a man who recognized that true beauty emerged from character forged in adversity's fire. Like the metal Thomas shaped daily in his forge, they had both been tested by flame, emerging not unmarked, but ultimately stronger for the tempering. And in finding each other, they had discovered something profound, that sometimes, the most meaningful connections form between those who have weathered similar storms and learned to value the resilience such weathering creates. Up next, You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.